Hello, everyone. This is Sunil Arora from Schwegman, Lundberg, and Wosner. I'd like to welcome you to our 2021 annual diversity keynote address. This session today is being presented and co-hosted with the High Tech Law Institute of Santa Clara University School of Law, and also together with Mitchell Hamlin School of Law here in Minneapolis. So thank you for joining us. This is a very special event. It's something that we do once a year to get a little bit off the beaten path. We host a number of different diversity webinars and training during the year. But the interesting thing about this webinar is we get to focus in on some really interesting topics and bring in some really interesting speakers. So just to give a little bit of a historical context for what we've done in the past. This is the fourth keynote address that we've done. Our first keynote address dealt with transgender issues, was presented by Ellie Krieg, which was very eye-opening and interesting. Our second keynote address was presented by Stephanie Glaros of Humans of Minneapolis. It dealt with issues of compassion, also very eye-opening and interesting. And last year, we had our keynote address that dealt with implicit bias and was presented by Kristen Haugen. So now this year we have Dr. David Farrar that is going to be presenting our annual address. It is entitled The Positive Psychology of Mentoring, How to Find a Good Mentor and How to Be a Good Mentor. So you should feel free to enter any questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom menu. And time permitting, we will address questions at the end of the webinar. We'd also like to invite you to follow us on LinkedIn to see news about other upcoming webinars. So before we get started, just to let you know that a link to the recording and slides will be emailed to all the registrants here today. Questions, you can type in the question box and we'll try to answer any technical issues or things that need to be clarified in real time. And any other questions or comments will be addressed at the Q&A in the end. And I'd like to invite you to follow us on social media, on LinkedIn, or to go to SLW Institute on slw.com to see upcoming on-demand webinars. Michelle, do you have anything you'd like to add to that before we jump into our polling questions?
No, I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us today.
Okay, with that, we have a few initial polling questions that we would like to present to people. Michelle, if you could present our polling questions.
Sure, and our first question is, have you ever been someone's mentor? And you can go ahead and answer on your screen. And lots of people answering. Thank you so much for your participation. And we'll give it a few more seconds. And I'll go ahead and end the poll. And here are the results. So it looks like about 72% of people have been someone's mentor.
Could you give us our second polling question, Michelle?
Absolutely. So our second polling question is, have you ever been mentored? We're getting lots of answers. And we'll give it a few more seconds. And I'll go ahead and end polling. And here are the results. So it looks like about 78% of people have been mentored. And then our third question for right now is, so in general, how comfortable do you feel offering to be someone's mentor? Do you feel very uncomfortable, uncomfortable, somewhat uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, comfortable, or very comfortable. And we'll give it a few more moments. And I'll go ahead and end polling. And we'll share the results. And it looks like, so most people feel either somewhat uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, or comfortable. And a few people are very comfortable.
Okay, well, thanks, Michelle. I think we can revisit those questions at the end when we're doing our Q&A. But before we begin, I would, excuse me, like to introduce today's speaker, David Farrar. Dr. David Farrar's expertise is in the psychology of business. David is an Australian who's been living in the US since 2001. He's a trained psychologist with international experience as an executive consultant and a speaker. David works with senior executives, with management teams, and with leaders as an executive coach and a consultant, helping lead them and their organizations through significant change. And the paybacks for his clients regularly have broad strategic impact. David studied at the Royal Military College of Australia, the University of Melbourne, and Northwestern University, the Kellogg School of Business, and has degrees in economics and psychology. He completed his graduate work with honors and was accredited as a psychologist in the Commonwealth of Australia. And with that, I will turn it over to David. David?
Thank you, Sunil and Michelle. Thank you both very, very much. You can tell I'm not from around here as soon as I open my mouth and you hear my Australian accent. It's a great pleasure to do the session today on mentorship. Mentoring is something that is very important to me. It's quite personal to me. I like the idea a lot of helping people be mentors, and you'll see some of that as we go through the material today. The polling questions were very interesting. What I got from the polling is that about 3/4 of you have been mentors or have been mentored, and that if I thought about people who were comfortable or very comfortable offering, that was about 1/3 of the people on the call. So hopefully we can move that across by the end so more people feel comfortable. What I'll be talking about, a tale of mentorship missed, will be some of my personal experience. What makes a good mentor relationship? I'm going to take a psychological approach to break that apart and show you what dynamics are going on in a good relationship. And then some of the practical things where you can find a mentor, how to ask someone to be a mentor, and how to offer to mentor somebody else. And then at the end, why this all matters, to kind of wrap it up. And while a lot of the examples will be from the legal profession, a lot of this material is applicable to many people in all professions. So here's how I will begin. I started law school at 18. That is not unusual where I come from. In Australia and in the United Kingdom and in many similar places with a common law background, law school starts straight after high school. So you finish your high school and you decide you're streamed where you want to go. And I thought I always wanted to be a lawyer. You can see from the little picture on there, I went to an old 1850s type campus that had cloisters, and the law school and the university that I went to was ranked as one of the top 20 universities in the world at the time. So it was a great opportunity, and it was a wonderful thing for me to be able to go there as an 18-year-old. But having said that, my experience in law school was not great for lots of reasons. And some of the context, I thought I really wanted to be a trial attorney, probably because I grew up in the 1970s in an era of programs on television like Petrocelli and Ironside. I had a very romantic image of what a trial attorney does. No one in my family was a lawyer. No one in my family had ever graduated from college. In fact, no one in my family had ever graduated from high school. I discovered when I was in my 40s, talking to my parents one day, my father left school at 14 and my mother left school when she was 9, which is mind-blowing to me and impossible to imagine in a modern world. I didn't know anyone who was going to college with me, so I went to a university that was kind of local, but far enough away that not many people from my physical location went there. And probably most interesting of all is that I had never met a lawyer, let alone had any kind of relationship with one. So I went to law school with no context at all for what law school might be like or what being an attorney might be like. And when I started, I did okay at law school. For criminal law, for example, I got honours and a little shout out from the faculty. But over time, my results trended more and more towards the average, for want of a better word. And at some point, I was actually doing a second degree for fun in economics, and a member of the faculty had a chat with me about my results and the trend. Things were going well elsewhere, not so well in law. And the discussion they had with me was about a thing that was called back then academic rehabilitation, which was basically, you're doing okay, but you might think about whether this is really for you. And as part of the discussion, the faculty said to me, we can find you a place in any other course on campus. Go and do anything you like, come back after 12 months and see if that's refreshed your enthusiasm for law. And I'm somewhat ashamed to say, I said to the dean of the faculty, what's the easiest thing on campus? And the dean said to me, psychology. And I went and enrolled in the psychology department. And the psychology department was the opposite of my experience in the law faculty. The psychology faculty assigned us to study groups. So we were automatically given a group of people that we were going to work with. They mixed people who were straight from high school with mature age students. At that stage, the law degree in Australia was 5 years plus a year as an article clerk to get your past the bar. And I was in my 4th year of the 5-year program. So I was a mature age student and I was with other like straight from high school students. We were all given a tutor and there were fixed tutorial sessions that you turned up to every week on a one-to-one basis with someone from the faculty. Professors were available on a walk-in basis. And part of your professional registration as a psychologist at that time was 2 years post-graduation supervised practice signed off by a registered psychologist. And all of that is to say my experience in psychology was so much better than my experience in law. And I put a lot of that down to navigational guidance. When you don't know the landscape, having other people around who can help you navigate that landscape is incredibly powerful. And I floundered as a law student, not because of it being academically difficult, but because I had no idea what I was doing in general. And my experience in psychology was the opposite. And I think from my point of view, I can draw a link between that experience and the experience of mentoring in general. Mentoring comes from Greek. It comes from the Odyssey. Odysseus, or Ulysses, he goes off to fight the Trojan War. And while he's away, he leaves his son in the care of a person called Mentor. And that's where we get mentoring from. And there's sort of a problem, I think, with taking mentor like this, because there's a hangover. We think that a mentor is someone who instills a kind of heroic mentality, that Ulysses' son is left behind and he grows up to be a young man who can do wonderful things because he had mentor. And that's a little too heroic, I think. Mentoring is probably, for most of us, much more mundane. It looks a lot more like this. This is sort of a quote from a young associate talking about their experience when they started law. It's their first job in a law office, and an experienced legal assistant acted as their mentor for a few months, helping them understand how things got done and how to prepare essential documents. One of the partners mentored them in doing their first depositions and establishing relationships with the firm's clients, and that mentor was one of the partners. And the example here, I think, is that the mentor can be a legal assistant, it can be one of the partners, and what they're providing is navigational guidance. If I think back to what I was like when I graduated from university, I was next to useless in a practical sense, and that a lot of people benefit from that navigational guidance of how to get things done. And it doesn't have to be heroic, it can be mundane, and it can be exceedingly high level and complex, but all of that is mentoring. Here is another perspective on the same thing. Back in 2006, the Ohio Supreme Court's Commission on Professionalism was going down the track of looking at mandatory mentoring relationships for young attorneys admitted to the bar. And they described that mentoring relationship like this, that it should foster the development of the lawyer's practical skills, which is what we were talking about before, and increase their knowledge of legal customs, which is kind of that unspoken how we get things done around here. And then it should also create a sense of pride and integrity in the legal profession. Mentoring should promote collegial relationships amongst professionals and involvement in the organized bar. So if you don't know anybody, it brings you into the organized bar so you start to know people. It improves legal ability and professional judgment, which is sort of technical skills, and also encourages the use of best practice and the highest ideals. And I think this is sort of a summary of that heroic aspect of mentoring and also some of the very mundane aspects of mentoring. And in fact, I think Ohio did introduce mandatory mentoring for newly admitted attorneys. And this is what they aspired to do with those folk. What I'd like to do then is to give you a breakdown of what that mentoring relationship looks like at its best from a psychologist's point of view. What successful mentors offer is psychological safety. This is a review, Harvard Business Review quotation on here, because psychological safety is something that a lot of corporate researchers are finding is extremely important for high-performing teams and high-performing individuals. Psychological safety is that idea that when things go wrong, you won't be punished, or it won't be sink or swim and you'll be left to sink. It'll be the idea that you can take moderate risks and you can speak up, and that those kinds of behaviors will be safely allowed inside that environment. Psychological safety is one of those things that enables people to perform at their highest. Psychological safety itself is made up of these four elements. So if you want to be a good mentor, you should offer psychological safety. And the four elements here are giving other people the benefit of the doubt, open sharing, comfort with mistakes, and respecting differences. And different researchers will have slightly different definitions, but this is a generic thing that covers, if you wanted to offer psychological safety and you had these four, people would feel psychologically safe. The first one of those is very applicable if you're thinking about how do you begin a mentoring relationship. Open sharing is the idea of appropriately letting others into the world as you experience it. So thinking back to my example, if I had known some attorneys and they had shared with me what the world of being an attorney was like, I would probably have been better prepared to make my way through law school, for example. And here's another one, that psychological safety means giving people the benefit of the doubt. When someone takes a risk or whatever, we should assume they're well-intentioned and motivated to do better. People don't get so far that you might be their mentor without them being motivated to do better and probably being well-intentioned to move on that path. Comfort with mistakes is the idea that when people make mistakes, you should always see them as an opportunity to learn and grow. Punishing people for doing things wrong is not as potent as rewarding people when they do things right and guiding them when they do things wrong. So that's kind of a mental twist that people should make about how they relate to people who make mistakes if they're in a mentoring relationship. And this last one, I think, ties in very closely with that idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Respecting differences is not what people sometimes think it is. For example, it's not simply ignoring the differences. For a little while, I have been a commissioner on the Civil Rights Commission in our city. And one of the first things, I would run across is people who would say, I don't see color. And ignoring a difference is actually quite insulting to the person who might be different. And diversity and equity inclusion is not about ignoring people. And similarly, it's not about tolerating differences. No one wants to be tolerated. Instead, what it's about is appropriately recognizing differences that people have, working to understand how they're significant, and then responding with interest and courtesy and positive regard. I think that sort of sums up that whole diversity, equity, and inclusion thing in terms of how do you treat people differently by respecting the differences. But that's a little summary of psychological safety. Why do people do that in a mentoring relationship? Because if you offer people psychological safety, you do it so they can grow psychological capital. And psychological capital you can think of as just like financial capital. It's the set of resources that people have to improve their performance on the job and transfer the things they learn from one context to another. Just like financial capital enables you to do things that people without money can't do, psychological capital enables you to behave in ways that people who don't have the capital can't behave in. And it looks like this. Psychological capital, the resource that you're hoping to build in the person who is being mentored, is a sense of optimism, a sense of resilience, hope about a positive future, and efficacy. So these four kind of go with the four above. And if you break them down, efficacy is a fancy psychologist term for the thing that most people think they're doing when they're mentoring. Confidence in the ability to control the outcome and overcome difficult challenges sometimes is instilled by showing people what to do. If you don't know how to do a deposition and you show somebody, they're more confident in doing it the next time. But efficacy doesn't just come about from being trained. Efficacy, the confidence, can be if people model the way that they learn how to do things, you don't have to be trained in how to do them yourself because you've been modeled in learning how to learn. So efficacy isn't just being able to do something, it's being confident that you're able to do something. And that, I think, is an important thing that mentors do. And good mentors don't just show people how to do stuff. They show people how to learn how to do stuff so that the people increase their confidence. Optimism is another one. Believe it or not, optimism is another fancy psychologist term. If somebody is just always, everything's going to turn out great and they're Pollyanna, that's probably not optimism. That's probably just some strange way they frame the world. Just like if someone always says things are going to turn out for the worst. What most people do, the reason why most people are optimistic or pessimistic, is to do with the 3 Ps: permanence, pervasiveness, and whether something is seen as personal. To give you an example, if something good happens to someone who has optimism, they're likely to think that's probably going to stick and be permanent. If it's a good thing here, I can probably generalize it and make it pervasive. And if a good thing happened, it was probably some part of me that did that. And so optimistic people have a way of framing the 3 Ps. If people are generally pessimistic, they frame the 3 Ps differently. Something bad happens and they think, you know, that's probably going to keep happening. Something bad happens, they think it's not just here, that's probably ruined everything. And something bad happens and they kick themselves. And they have the same reverse when something good happens. It's probably not permanent, probably won't apply elsewhere, and it's probably not about me. And people who are optimistic think when something bad happens, it's probably not permanent, probably won't happen all the way everywhere, and some of it's my fault, but it's not like I'm a bad person. One of the things that mentors can do is help people frame things in an optimistic way according to the 3 Ps. And if you think about it, a lot of clinical work with people who've got clinical problems is helping them reframe things and see them differently. Resilience is that ability to bounce back. And if you're mentoring somebody and you see that something happens to them that has knocked them down, then being able to discuss with them how to come back, modeling how to come back, modeling how to take risks and not see them in one of those unfortunate 3 P ways, all builds up resilience, and resilience is psychological capital. And the last one, which I can relate back to my law school experience as well, is hope. You start something like law school or something like your time with a new firm or being a new employee in a new company or whatever, with both hope, an agency that you're going to succeed, and a pathway you can see how you can succeed. And what good mentors can do that builds psychological capital is the idea that they can help people with motivation, so they can show them what's the shiny object at the end, and also they can help them with a pathway. Like when you start, you may not see how you might become a partner, or when you start, you may not see how you can become a director, but let me talk to you about how other people have done it, or how I've done it, or how we can see you could do it. Agency plus pathway equals hope, and people need hope. That is the shortened version of the psychological model of how mentoring works. So these couple of slides are around sort of like putting that I just talked about into practice. Why it matters. One reason that mentoring is important, particularly in a legal context, is that it's a structured way for senior attorneys to develop relationships with more junior attorneys. Particularly in non-corporate environments, something that I run into with my clients all the time is that they get to be partners, they manage very significant matters, and compared to their colleagues who might work in a corporate environment, that same level in a corporate environment would be, I used to be a team leader, then I became a supervisor, then I became a manager, then I became a senior manager, then I became an associate director and a director, and one day I became a VP. And VP is like those partners. But inside of practice, there isn't that same pathway, so that senior attorneys have not gone through the same set of formal, structured steps that develops relationships with other people. And mentoring is one of the ways that you can do that inside a practice. Another reason why this is important is that mentoring is a way that institutional knowledge gets passed down. That we all know that we sort of have a hangover from the baby boomers, in which a lot of people with a lot of institutional knowledge are likely to leave the profession, and there are fewer people coming in a generational sense. Mentoring is one of the ways that that knowledge can get passed down. And in a very practical, transactional sense, inside a firm, mentoring is one of the ways that skills and relationships that retain clients can get passed down. Because mentoring people brings them into your relationships with your clients, and that in turn enables them to smoothly ramp up the client relationship skills they need. Fourth point, I mentioned navigational guidance before, and this relates a lot to the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Navigational guidance is that idea that if I've never been through this landscape before, I don't know how to get around. Like me in law school as an 18-year-old, or me as a new person starting in a practice. And that if you come from maybe a minority, or if you come from an area where your background means that it's difficult for you to identify with other folk inside the place where you're working, navigational guidance is having someone who can show you the ropes, who can show you the landscape and the pathways that people get around and get stuff done. And in a DEI sense, having mentoring relationships is extremely important for folk that don't have navigational experience. One of the other things that I think makes mentoring particularly important for legal practice is that a lot of law is tradecraft. There's so much that you learn in a academic sense, but there's much that you learn just from seeing how law is practiced. And tradecraft, law schools are getting a lot better at ensuring that people aren't left like I was left in the 70s and 80s. But still, a lot of the tradecraft of law is learned through a process of trial and error. And hopefully, inside of a firm, you don't want too much of the error part. You don't want the error part occurring with client matters and client relationships. So people can do a long process of trial and error, or mentoring can accelerate that process of learning tradecraft. This is a little bit about something in the preparation for this that we thought was very important. People knowing where to find a mentor. Mandatory programs that people set up where people are assigned for mentors can be very important in a forced knowledge transfer kind of scenario, where we need people to learn stuff. Learning from a model is a very efficient way of learning. Psychologists think there's only a few ways that learning happens. There's instructional learning. There's the sort of trial and error where you get rewards and punishments depending on how you do. And there's modeling. And modeling, seeing something done successfully, is a very potent way of learning things, which is why mandatory programs are often put into place to help people with things they need to learn in a very efficient way. When we think about the awareness we have nowadays for diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, which is sort of the theme of all of these different webinars, voluntary programs where people can choose their mentors and who they want to mentor fit well with the idea of people being able to engage in a mentor relationship that is something they're participating in a positive way, and learning through who they choose to be modeled by. Nowadays, lots of law schools, lots of employers, lots of state bar associations have mentor programs. If you want to find a mentor, you should probably ask your employer or go back to your law school or check your state bar association, because there may well be something in place already. One of the trends that I've seen is that in private practice, that idea of individual attorneys taking on newer associates and colleagues has started to fall away somewhat. It used to be that one great way of succeeding in a law firm was to find a partner who was close to retirement and latch onto that partner and hope that their clients would fall your way. I'm sure that still happens, but business pressures and different things that are happening in terms of expectations mean that you can't rely on that. So you may have to find your own mentors. The same Ohio Columbus Bar Association that I talked about earlier, they surveyed their members back in 2003, some of the preludes to the mandatory program, and found that 88% of associates thought mentoring was very important, but only like a quarter of the associates said they could find a mentor. So what I say to folk that I'm talking to is, it's a good idea to be on the lookout for mentors all the time. And you've seen the model, so you know what they're going to offer and what you'll gain from it, and keep your eye open for people who might be a good mentor for you. In terms of being able to make that connection, what I'll say here is that what I'm going to talk about are social skills. This isn't a technology. When you try to do what I show you next, sometimes it will feel clunky at first, but over time, social skills get better with practice. So I'm going to show you some social skills that I think are going to help you be a better mentor and be able to find mentors. The first of them is this golden triangle. This is a psychologist's model, the safety, engagement, commitment model. And to walk you through it, what it says is that people are more likely to change their minds, their behavior, their attitudes when they feel safe. People who don't feel safe don't feel that it's comfortable to make any of those changes. So the first thing people have in terms of change is they need safety. And then the second thing is engagement. People like stuff done with them rather than to them. People are somewhat oppositional by nature. Few people like to be told what to do, but people like to be engaged in the process of what's being done. And finally, commitment is the idea that if you get people to make a little commitment, it's easier for them over time to build up to bigger commitments. So productive check-ins is if you go to have a check-in with someone as a mentor, as a mentee, you should try and follow this golden triangle. I talk sometimes with partners who say they check in with their associates, and I say, what do you call a check-in? And they'll tell me, well, we do a post-mortem after any important matters. And I'm like, oh my God, even calling it a post-mortem sounds terrible. And they'll have a discussion with someone about what went well and what went badly. And when you have that kind of discussion and people are used to, that's the way you deal with them, then all through the what went well, they're waiting for the other foot to drop, the other shoe to drop about what went badly.
David,
This
if I could
better
interrupt you briefly, we just want to let you know that this current slide did not advance. We are still seeing the slide that says these are social skills.
Oh, how is that possible?
There we go.
You're still seeing that slide?
Yep.
Are you now seeing that slide?
Yep, we're on the SEC model, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Genevieve Farrar, who is my partner at work and at life. This was the model that I was referring to, safety, engagement, commitment. And then to put it into practice, the thing that I was saying was a better way of doing a productive check-in is that if you want to talk to someone about how something's going, you say to them to begin with, so tell me, that last matter that you handled, how do you think that went? And help them focus on what's going well. If they drop into this thing was terrible, remember what we just said about optimism and framing. But generally, talk about what's going well. And then, as it says with the next little bullet over here, let me see if I can make my cursor do fancy things. With this little bullet, go on to engagement. So if that's what went well, what opportunities do you see for things that could be done better? And a good mentor will see some opportunities and then will also say, if the person hasn't seen a particular opportunity, what about this thing or that thing? And finally, if you're having a productive check-in with somebody, do something that looks like having them make a commitment. If this matter went well, except for the opportunity to do that thing differently, what are you going to do next time? And then when you come back to them next time, you start off with, so that matter that you last did, you said you were going to do this thing differently. How did that go? Productive check-ins, I will say to people, this one slide is like 6 years of clinical psychology in one picture. This is essentially what clinical psychologists do and help them frame things differently, show them pathways and models. But I've tried to pull that apart and break it and show you one picture of that. I'm going to hope that that slide just advanced then, and Genevieve will tell me if it didn't. So thinking of that model, how do you make the ask? How do you ask somebody to be a mentor? Find an appropriate time and place, and then use the safety, engagement, commitment model. You make the ask by safely describing the guidance that you're looking for. Hey, Fred or Betty, I saw that thing that you did, and that thing was pretty cool. And engaging me let them know why you'd ask them. So the engagingly piece is, I like the way you did that. Let's talk a bit about that. I'll be interested to find out what you did. And then commitment, confirm your commitment and follow through while suggesting one small next step. That was cool. I appreciated it. We've just talked about it. Could we meet for coffee for 10 minutes? What doesn't work in terms of making the ask is not safely describing the guidance. So if you describe it in a way that sounds like there's a lot of risk involved, or if you don't engage them by making it two-way, or if you ask for your commitment and it's too big, people will take one small step and that'll lead up to something big rather than think about taking the big step initially. Similarly, if you want to make the offer, you want to offer someone to mentor them, find an appropriate time and place, and then use the SEC model again. Safely describe what you see, engagingly let them know what you can offer, and then confirm a small commitment. So if you're a partner in a law firm, you might have been assigned someone as their mentor, and you can use the model. But if you haven't been assigned and you're a partner in a law firm, you might say to someone, I hear that you're going to do one of your first depositions. And I know when I was doing my first deposition that I wondered how I should dress, what I should say in terms of the tone of voice, should I be combative or not? And I'm wondering if you're thinking about those things too. That's engaging. And if they say, yeah, sure, you can say, well, if you'd like to meet over coffee or lunch tomorrow, I'll be happy to talk about it with you. Safety, engagement, commitment. That is like the psychologist's magic triangle. Lastly, what activities can you do during a mentoring relationship? If you're setting up something formal in your organization, or if you've been assigned a mentor as a mentee, what I hear most people focus on doing is this informal, semi-social get-togethers where we discuss work. And that's great. Sometimes job shadowing. Come along and follow me while I'm doing a thing. Some more creative and more risk-taking people say, why don't we do a CLE together and we'll discuss it together afterwards? Or why don't we attend some bar association or professional event together? And I think all of those things are great. And what I would add up here is use the productive check-in model as a way of structuring those things. If you have an informal or semi-social get-together, then start it with, so what's been going well for you lately? And then reframe as appropriate if the person hasn't had things going well. But you want to get into that kind of routine or rhythm where it starts to be, here's what's going well, here's some opportunities we'd like to discuss, what will I do next time? And go through that as a kind of routine operation each time you meet. Oh. Yep, sorry. Some program guidelines. If you're setting something up, or even if it's just a one-to-one thing where you're setting up a relationship. And this sort of applies for either the mentor or the person being mentored. Set clear expectations, which sounds obvious, but there are kind of traps in mentoring as a legal professional. So not just when and where and how often, but also things like in the mentoring relationship, will the mentor be giving advice on specific matters? In some contexts, that might be appropriate. In many contexts, it wouldn't be. You're providing navigational guidance much more than you're providing people with training on how to do it. And giving people advice on specific matters has all sorts of other implications. Another guideline that I think is worthwhile to consider is whether or not you expect, or there is an expectation that the mentor will be a direct advocate for career advancement. Many people think if I get a mentor, that person will actually advocate and push me forward. And I don't think that's something that most or many mentors want to actually take on. Another one is the mentor's responsibility to check the soundness of the advice given. In a legal relationship, that has all sorts of implications, but even outside of a formal legal relationship, the mentee is the person who should be like building up their judgment to decide if this one person's advice is as sound as the one person may think it is. And finally, with regard to safety, depending on how the relationship is set up, you should know going into it if the mentor is going to be reporting in on progress. That may be appropriate in a relationship where it's maybe part of a formal program through law school or through the practice or work. But if it is going to happen, you should kind of know that so you can safely know what it's appropriate to share with each other. I think the person being mentored takes responsibility for the agenda of the relationship. I think mentoring is something that's done with the person being mentored, not to the person being mentored. Regardless of who initiates it, I think that. And one of the reasons I think that is this thing called the Ikea Effect. So here's another 30-second psychological thing. Psychologists refer to this even in the literature as the Ikea Effect. People support what they help to create. And this is illustrated by when Ikea tests out their new products, they'll get in a bunch of consumers, I believe, to build the thing at the Ikea store, the piece of furniture. And at the end, in many of these examples and in many of the research examples that have tried to replicate this, they'll ask people, for your participation, thank you very much. You may take home the coffee table, chair, whatever. And they give them a choice. Would you rather take home the one you built, or would you rather take home the one built by our Ikea professional? And even though the one you built yourself, if you're like me, usually has one or two parts left over, and it's kind of wobbly because I didn't tighten the things I should have, people most often choose to take home the one they built themselves. People appreciate what they help to create. And that effect as a mentor is something that you can buy into. That doing mentoring with a person and allowing them to drive it means they're more likely to support the outcomes and more likely to actually change in a productive way. I also say to people, you shouldn't expect a mentor is for life. Mentors can be very short term. It's appropriate if you first started. How do I learn how the photocopier works? How do I learn to electronically file? But once that's over, that mentoring relationship may be gone, or you may have a longer term relationship. It's okay to change and it's okay to move on. Looking at my timing, sources and further readings. You will all receive a digital copy of the materials today. I believe that when you get them, these links will be live so that you'll be able to click on the materials some of the materials that I use to research the material today. If you want to get in touch with myself or our firm, we have a giveaway that's on that psychologist's golden triangle, how to use that productive check-in with clients, how to use that productive check-in with prospects, how to use it with clients after you've completed a matter. So we've got some worked examples in that, and we'll be happy to share that PDF with anyone who gets in touch with us. This final slide, I'm going to try not to get emotional during this. This is a very personal piece for me. The mentoring relationship that I'm most proud of when I first came to the United States, and I didn't know much and didn't know how to get along and navigationally and whatever. And I went to Big Brother, Big Sister and asked them and found out if there were things that I could do. I wasn't registered here. I couldn't do anything formally. And I was assigned a young little brother as part of the program. Excuse the quality of this photograph, but if you can see front and center in the middle here, this is New York. This is the Morgan Stanley building. And that young man is Elvis Rivera. And Elvis was my little brother in that program. A really nice guy. And I took him on as a little brother, and I hope I provided him with mentoring. And I'm very proud of the fact that he now is a wealth management advisor with Morgan Stanley. And during the recent Hispanic Heritage Month, they actually had his face digitally blown up and on the side of their building in New York. So like I said at the beginning, mentoring is really important to me. I think it's a really valuable thing for many people. And I don't take any credit for how Elvis turned out, but I'm incredibly proud of that thing that we did together. I think that is pretty much on time for the Q&A piece. I would like to thank you all very much for your interest and the interaction. I see lots of chat and Q&A going backward and forward. So thank you very much. And then we have some time in which I will try and Sunil to do our best to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. I'll take the blown up picture of my face off there because you don't want to look at that for too long. So Sunil, it's off with you with any questions that we've had coming in.
David, can you hear me?
Ah, now I can hear you.
Okay, sorry about sorry about that. So that was excellent presentation. We've got some really good questions coming in, and so I think we'll start by just queuing up some of the questions that came in. One question asks or states that research shows that people naturally wish to mentor people that remind them of themselves. Do you have any thoughts on successfully mentoring someone who is very different, you know, from yourself?
That's a really good one. The reason people like to mentor people that remind them of themselves is identity. That people have personalities and people have temperaments, which is sort of like the general direction in which their personality leads them to behave. And then people have identities, which is that idea that, you know, inside, this is who I really am. And people try biologically to find other people that they can identify with. My experience with the Civil Rights Commission, I'm an older white male, and I do not look like a lot of the people that the Civil Rights Commission is trying to advocate for. And what I found, and I think what your question says, is that for the person offering the mentoring, if you let identity get in the way, that can be a problem. But the piece that I was trying to say earlier on is that with regard to respecting differences, acknowledging differences and taking a genuine interest in their significance helps to breach that barrier that identity might put in place, because you start to see who the real person is inside, which takes account of some of those other differences as well, but enables you to form connections. I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but it was like identity is important and the mentor has to work hard to overcome identity barriers.
David, another question that we had to do with sponsorship. And I know before the session, we were talking a little bit about mentoring and supervising, and there is the whole notion of sponsorship, and all of these things are slightly different from each other, but they are often found together in this relationship. You know, mentoring often occurs in the context of supervising, and sponsorship certainly is important to people's professional development. You know, do you want to spend a few minutes just kind of clarifying, you know, differences in the terminology and how a supervisory relationship can evolve into mentoring, and how mentoring can evolve into sponsorship? And
yeah.
I know you did talk about navigational guidance. So I mean, to me, that you know, is different from actually supervising. But if you could just talk about, you know, these different levels of engagement.
I think an analogy is when you meet parents who say, I am my child's best friend. And I know that's possible, and I know that over time that can evolve. But if you think of yourself purely as your child's friend, you've probably lost something of what it means to be the parent. And supervisor and mentor is a bit the same. A supervisor can be a mentor and vice versa, but the roles are kind of different. With a supervisor, much of what you do is not navigational guidance. Much of what you do is, if you're on a freeway, you can think of as the barriers. It's being able to say to people, not this way, not that way, but some way in here. And supervision often requires the supervisor to closely monitor the risks that are taken. Maybe the supervisor has at their interest the firm's interests, and you may learn from making that mistake, but it's not a mistake that the firm is prepared to undertake. So supervisors have a different role. The mentor often provides navigational guidance. Choose the highway you want to be on. and be aware that there are these barriers, but let's talk about the risks and if you want to engage in those risks. So the two roles can be quite distinct. Over time, supervisors can turn into mentors as they relax the barriers. And over time, mentors can become that kind of advocate and champion for someone as the relationship develops. But I don't think people should expect that the three roles are all the same, because they can be quite different. Any other questions?
Yeah, great. That was very helpful. Can you still hear me, David?
Yes,
Okay,
perfectly.
great. So there is another question that came in that I'd like to frame up in terms of a question that I had, because I think it fits right in with something that I've been thinking about and wondering about. I have been thinking about whether there are any psychological characteristics or traps that a mentor can have that could be overcome by self-awareness to help somebody become a better mentor. And so the example that I was going to say is, you know, if you're a worrier like myself, how do you keep that sort of psychological characteristic from turning you into sort of a helicopter mentor, you know, assuming that, you know, that's actually a thing, like a helicopter parent. And the question that came in actually said, how do you overcome a perception by some mentors who may interpret your overtures as stealing their work or their clients? So people who are maybe not as trustful as toward potential mentees. So I think these are two different examples of psychological characteristics that people can have that may, you know, really inhibit them actually becoming a mentor at all, or becoming a good mentor. Any thoughts about that?
I was waiting for all the softball questions, Sunil, so I hope you got those lined up somewhere. I'm going to answer that question in two parts. The second part first. The idea that, you know, I'm asking someone to mentor you is equivalent to stealing their skills and property stuff. And I know that is a problem inside some private practices. And I think that's the thing that should be moderated by the firm. When you're a successful attorney, it's like you have your own business inside a bigger business. And firms have different approaches to how that works. In some firms, the culture is you literally have a different business, and it's more like you're a franchisee than anything else. And those people like to keep their practice to themselves, and they see other people learning from them as being potentially like stealing, and potentially like, the more you learn how to do this, the less work there is for me. I think firms, well, if I think of the firms I would like to work in, I would like a firm to moderate that, to say your clients are your clients and the firm's clients. Your templates for how to do that are your templates and the firm's templates. And we all do better when we all do better. And that's kind of a philosophical argument. There's no psychological mentality behind that. That's just where I would be more comfortable working. And I think that, you know, as a professional, people should choose where they want to work as best they can. The thing about the temperament of the mentor, some mentors are what you describe as warriors. Some people are by nature more anxious than others. And the helicopter mentoring may be confusing that role of what makes me anxious and what I think they should be anxious about. When I work with senior professionals, almost always I begin with some kind of 360 type assessment and start off by holding the mirror up to the person and saying, this is how you come across at work. And self-awareness helps people see how their behavior is interpreted by others and helps them to moderate it somewhat. Real warriors will always be real warrior type mentors. And as a mentee, you know, you should choose if that's the kind of person you want to work with. Maybe that'll make you really comfortable, or maybe it won't.
I do want to add, you know, my own thought about that, you know, that tendency for people who view relationships as more transactional in nature, or who are maybe less willing to share work or to share clients, You know, my own thought about that whole thing is that those people don't necessarily realize that over time, the people that end up giving out the work evolve. You know, it's a younger group of people that are in-house that are handing out the work. It's a more diverse group of people that are in-house that are giving out the work. So, you know, from my perspective, mentoring is actually one of the best things that you can do to actually ensure that you have work and clients well into the future. And, you know, recognizing that continuity, not only for the firm, but for your own practice, is sometimes I think that's hard to make people, you know, see things from that point of view. And I'll also just say that it leads to a better client experience when, you know, clients don't see, you know, bottlenecks in terms of the relationship attorney within the firm, and they have, you know, multiple points of entry. So, you know, I do think that there's value there.
I think that's totally true. And in a transactional sense, if I occasionally happen to be working with someone who thinks in a transactional way, I'm giving away work that I could be doing, you know, this is better for my piece of the practice if I don't, I will say to them on a transactional basis, if you have that mentality in terms of advancing in your firm, even in a purely selfish way, you will never go higher and your practice will never be any bigger than the work you can put your own arms around and do yourself. But if you mentor other associates and you develop great relationships, they will bring you clients. You can give them work that you would rather not be doing, and you end up on the top of a pyramid of people who are actually all part of doing work that advances your career. In a purely selfish transactional basis, the best mentors I see are the ones who advance more than the people who keep it all to themselves on a purely transactional basis.
Well, David, thank you for that. I think we've hit as many of the questions as we have time for, and we're actually a little bit over the time allotted. I would just note that there's probably many more questions that could be asked and answered about mentoring. And so if people want to submit questions later on, we can try and address those questions offline. And David, I want to thank you for the presentation. It's excellent information and a really important subject. So thank you so much for taking the time to present today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you very much to Dr. Farrar and Genevieve for presenting. And thank you to Sunil for moderating. And we hope to see you all back for another SLW Institute webinar. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.